The pattern they couldn't explain. Content warning. This episode discusses medical evidence documented in autopsy findings and pediatric records. We will handle this information with care and clinical distance. The focus is on understanding patterns of behavior, not on explicit description. Viewer discretion is advised. There are truths that live in medical files, in notes jotted by pediatricians during routine visits, in autopsy reports written by coroners who document what they find without emotion, without narrative, without stake in what the findings might mean. These truths don't argue. They simply exist. And in the JonBenet Ramsey case, they exist in ways that raise questions the family has never answered. We've walked through the contaminated crime scene. We've examined the ransom note. That sounds like fiction. We've traced the DNA that was supposed to exonerate but only complicated the picture. We've sat with the pineapple, that ordinary detail that quietly dismantles the timeline. We've looked at Burke, the boy who was downstairs that night, whose presence keeps appearing in evidence while fading from the story told to police. But there's another layer, one that's been mentioned in passing, explained away with reasonable-sounding alternatives, or buried under the weight of everything else we're asked to believe. It's the medical evidence that suggests JonBenet was experiencing ongoing difficulties. Difficulties that predated December 25, 1996. Difficulties that were documented, brought to doctors, discussed with professionals. And when you sit with these records, when you trace the pattern they reveal, you start to ask a question that changes everything. If something was happening to JonBenet over time, something that caused recurring medical concerns, why didn't anyone stop it? The answer to that question is what we need to explore. Not with accusation, not with certainty we can't claim, but with the evidence as our guide, and with the understanding that sometimes the truth people can't face is the one that's been quietly present all along. Act 1. The medical history no one wanted to discuss. Let's start with what pediatric records show in the years before JonBenet was lost. There were visits, multiple visits over time, concerns that brought Patsy to the doctor with her daughter, concerns that were documented, treated, monitored. The medical term doesn't matter as much as what it represents. Recurring issues that required professional attention. Issues that, in a 6-year-old, prompt certain questions from pediatricians who follow protocols designed. When a child presents with chronic concerns in sensitive areas, doctors ask questions. They try to understand causation. Because while some explanations are innocent, hygiene practices, bubble baths, certain soaps, chronic patterns raise different considerations. According to those familiar with the case records, JonBenet's doctor did ask the appropriate questions. Questions about whether anything unusual might be happening at home. Questions about who had access to the child, who helped with bathing. And John and Patsy's answers were consistent. No, nothing unusual was happening. They attributed the recurring concerns to ordinary childhood causes, the kinds of explanations that are plausible for occasional issues. But the pattern continued. The visits continued. The concerns continued. From a medical standpoint, chronic issues in a young child are a marker, not proof of anything specific, but a signal that requires ongoing attention, careful monitoring, consideration of possibilities that go beyond the surface explanations. And yet, as far as we know from the available information, the explanations were accepted. The pattern was documented but not pursued with the depth it perhaps warranted. There's another detail in the medical and family history that matters. Both Burke and JonBenet struggled with bedwetting well past the age when most children achieve consistent nighttime control. Burke was 9, nearly 10, still having occasional accidents. JonBenet was 6, and experiencing them with some frequency. Bedwetting has many potential causes. Physiological factors, deep sleep patterns, developmental variations. But it can also be a manifestation of stress in children whose bodies are processing things their words can't express. In isolation, it means little. But in context, alongside the recurring medical visits, the documented concerns, there's also the detail about JonBenet's grandmother and her approach to preventing wet sheets during visits. According to family interviews, when JonBenet stayed with her grandmother in Atlanta, the grandmother would wake her during the night to use the bathroom. She didn't want to deal with laundry, so she established this routine, and JonBenet resisted strongly. Patsy described her daughter's reaction. JonBenet would kick and scream and fight when her grandmother tried to wake her. She didn't go quietly. She didn't accept it peacefully. Think about what this tells us. JonBenet had a powerful, visceral response to being woken from sleep. She fought it with everything a small child could muster. So when we're asked to believe that a stranger entered her room in the middle of the night and woke her without her screaming, without her fighting, without anyone in that house hearing her distress, a stranger would trigger terror, a scream that would wake the household. But there was silence, which means either JonBenet never woke up, which the pineapple in her stomach contradicts, or the person who woke her was someone she didn't fear, someone familiar, someone whose presence in the night didn't trigger panic. These details, the medical visits, the recurring concerns, where the question "why is this happening?" was answered with explanations that allowed everyone to move forward without looking too closely, where warning signs, if that's what they were documented but not pursued to their source. Act 2. What the autopsy revealed. On December 27, 1996, Dr. John Meyer conducted the autopsy that would become one of the most scrutinized documents in this entire case. His findings, recorded in clinical language, documented two categories of concern: acute injuries, those that occurred during the final hours of JonBenet's life, and findings that suggested a pattern extending back in time, evidence that something had been happening before that night, something that left markers in tissue, in healing patterns, in ways that medical professionals could read like a timeline. Dr. Meyer documented these observations with the precision required of his profession. He noted fresh trauma. He noted older changes that suggested previous incidents. When forensic pathologists and pediatric specialists reviewed his findings, their interpretations aligned. The evidence suggested this wasn't a singular event. The physical markers indicated a pattern, something that had occurred more than once over a period of time. There was also an unusual finding: the presence of cellulose material, wood or plant fibers, in places where such material should never be. This detail is significant not because of what it describes, but because of what it suggests about behavior. The use of objects in this manner is more consistent with exploratory behavior by someone who doesn't fully understand boundaries or consequences, someone acting on curiosity without the cognitive development to recognize harm. Adults who hurt children in these ways typically follow patterns that forensic psychologists have documented extensively. Those patterns don't usually include the use of environmental objects, wood, plant material, things grabbed from surroundings. But children who are curious. Children often engage in exploratory acts that involve whatever is at hand. It's not motivated by adult impulses. It's motivated by curiosity that exists outside the boundaries adults understand, but children haven't fully learned. When you find evidence of this kind, particularly materials that suggest items taken from the immediate environment, it raises the question: who would engage in this behavior? And the research on concerning behavior between siblings points toward an answer: a child. Someone whose actions are driven by curiosity and experimentation rather than the patterns associated with adults. The acute injuries documented that final night were serious. They would have caused pain, distress, likely crying. And the pattern that preceded them tells us this wasn't the first time something difficult had happened. Someone had access to JonBenet over time. Regular access. The kind of ongoing, private, unsupervised contact that allows patterns to develop. An intruder doesn't fit that timeline. An intruder doesn't have repeated access over months or years. Only someone in the household does. Act 3. The questions no one could answer. When investigators asked John and Patsy about the pattern revealed in the autopsy, about the evidence that something had been happening to their daughter over time, their response was to deny knowledge. We didn't know anything was happening. If we had known, we would have done something. But they did know something was concerning. They knew because they brought JonBenet to the pediatrician multiple times. They knew because they managed ongoing difficulties that required medical attention. They knew because these weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns that persisted. What they claim not to have known is the cause. But from a logical standpoint, that becomes harder to accept when you consider what the medical evidence revealed. When Lou Smith, an investigator who initially believed in the intruder theory and worked alongside the Ramsey legal team, asked John about certain forensic findings, the exchange revealed something telling. Fibers consistent with clothing John had worn were found during the examination. Smith asked John to explain how that transfer might have occurred. John's response wasn't explanatory. It was immediate defensiveness, anger, indignation. How dare you suggest? But he didn't answer the question. He didn't say, that probably transferred when I carried her upstairs, or maybe from when I helped her get ready for bed, or any of the innocent explanations that might account for fiber transfer through ordinary parental contact. He went straight to outrage, to shutting down the inquiry. From a psychological perspective, that's revealing. When someone responds to a factual question with disproportionate emotion, when they react as if they've been accused rather than asked, it often means the question has touched something they don't want examined. If the fibers transferred innocently, the natural response would be to explain how, to be curious about it yourself, to help piece together the puzzle. But John didn't want to explain. He wanted the questions to stop. Similarly, when investigators raised questions about the pattern documented in medical findings, about evidence that suggested ongoing difficulties predating that final night, John and Patsy's strategy was consistent. Minimize, deflect, redirect attention. They blamed the acute situation on the supposed intruder, but they offered no explanation for the chronic pattern. If a stranger caused what happened that night, who was responsible for what had been happening over time? A different person, someone else with regular access to JonBenet over months or years. Or the same person, someone in the house, someone the parents knew or suspected but couldn't bring themselves to confront. The investigative dilemma is stark. The acute and the chronic don't fit separate narratives. They're connected, part of the same story, and the only story that accounts for both is one that places the source inside the household. The parents' approach throughout the investigation remained consistent. Deny awareness of the chronic pattern. Attribute the acute situation to an outsider. Protect the family narrative at all costs. Don't acknowledge what the medical records show. Don't explain what doctors documented. Don't admit that something was happening in their home that they either didn't see or chose not to fully confront. Because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging failure. Failure to protect their daughter from something happening under their own roof. And worse, it would mean acknowledging who was responsible. Act 4. The pattern that only makes sense one way. Let's step back and look at what the totality of medical and forensic evidence suggests. JonBenet experienced a pattern of concerning situations over an extended period. This is documented in autopsy findings. It's consistent with her pediatric history of recurring medical visits. It aligns with markers that suggest ongoing access by someone familiar. This wasn't a single incident. This was repeated behavior across time. And the only people with that kind of access, the ongoing private, unsupervised contact required for such a pattern, are people within the household, family members, people JonBenet trusted, people she lived with every day. Research on concerning behavior between children shows clear patterns. It most commonly occurs between siblings or children in close domestic proximity. It often begins as what the perpetrating child might frame internally as games or curiosity, behaviors they may not fully understand as harmful, because they lack the developmental capacity to grasp impact. It escalates over time if unaddressed. What starts as boundary crossing can progress to more serious acts, particularly if the child discovers they can engage in the behavior without consequences. It's most prevalent in the age range of 8 to 12 years, exactly where Burke was during the years leading up to December 1996. And critically, it thrives in environments where parents are either genuinely unaware or operating in a state of denial, where warning signs are explained with surface-level causes, where the child learns, consciously or unconsciously, that they can continue without intervention. The scenario that emerges from the evidence is uncomfortable, but logically coherent. In the years before December 1996, something was happening between Burke and JonBenet. Something that manifested in the chronic concerns documented by medical professionals. Something that resulted in the pattern revealed in autopsy findings. Patsy and John either didn't recognize what was happening, which would require a level of parental disconnection difficult to square with their attentiveness in other areas, or they sensed something but couldn't bring themselves to fully investigate. They managed symptoms. They brought JonBenet to doctors and accepted explanations that allowed everyone to continue without disruption. They saw the bedwetting, the behavioral markers, the physical manifestations. This is denial, a psychological defense mechanism where truth is too threatening to face, so the mind constructs alternative explanations that feel safer, more manageable, more aligned with the family identity you want to maintain. Parents don't want to believe their child is capable of harming a sibling. The thought is too destabilizing. So they find other reasons, other explanations. They tell themselves stories that preserve the family image, while the uncomfortable truth operates just beneath conscious awareness. Until December 25th, 1996, when whatever had been quietly continuing finally crossed a threshold. Something acute. Something that couldn't be attributed to bubble baths or hygiene. Something that resulted in screaming. The scream melody Stanton heard between midnight and 2 a.m. And in that moment, John and Patsy faced a choice. They could tell the truth, acknowledge what had been happening, expose the pattern they'd been managing, consciously or unconsciously, for months or years. Or they could protect Burke, protect the family. Construct a narrative that would hide both the chronic pattern and the acute crisis. And they chose protection. The ransom note, the staging, the immediate lawyers, not just for themselves, but for Burke. The refusal to cooperate fully, the decades of deflection. All of it makes sense when you understand what they were protecting. Not just Burke's involvement that night, but their own failure to address what had been happening long before. Ending in. The medical evidence in this case tells a story that John and Patsy Ramsey have never been able to explain. A story of recurring concerns documented in pediatric visits over time. A story of autopsy findings that revealed both acute trauma and a chronic pattern. A story of parents who saw warning signs, the medical visits, the bedwetting, the behavioral markers. A story that answers the question that's haunted this case for 29 years. Why did they hire lawyers before JonBenet's body was even found? Because they knew enough. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not the full sequence of what happened in those final hours. But they knew enough. They knew Burke had been involved in behavior that concerned them. They knew the medical findings would reveal a chronic pattern that couldn't be blamed on a stranger. They knew that once investigators looked closely at family dynamics, uncomfortable truths would surface. And they knew that exposing those truths would mean acknowledging not just Burke's actions, but their own role in what had been allowed to continue. Their failure to protect JonBenet from difficulties happening in her own home. Their choice to manage symptoms without confronting sources. Their reluctance to see what might have been visible if they'd been willing to look. What happened that final night, the acute situation documented in the autopsy, didn't occur in isolation. It was the culmination of a pattern. A pattern that had been allowed to develop because the adults in the house couldn't or wouldn't recognize it for what it was. And when that pattern finally resulted in something they couldn't hide, they didn't choose truth. They chose protection. They staged a scene. They wrote a note. They hired attorneys, the best money could buy, not just for themselves, but for their 9-year-old son. They controlled the narrative, limited the investigation, spent decades deflecting questions and constructing alternative explanations. Because acknowledging the chronic pattern would mean acknowledging their own part in it. Not just in the cover-up that followed, but in everything that preceded it. In the years of accepting explanations that didn't quite fit. Of managing symptoms without asking deeper questions. of choosing comfort over confrontation, of protecting the family image, even when that protection came at the cost of their daughter's safety. The medical evidence doesn't offer opinions. It simply documents what was found. It tells us JonBenet was experiencing ongoing difficulties before the night she was lost. It tells us someone with regular access, someone in her home, someone in her family, was connected to those difficulties. It tells us her parents were aware of concerning patterns. They documented them in medical visits. They dealt with the manifestations, but they didn't stop the source. And when the pattern finally escalated beyond management, they chose to bury the truth rather than face it. For 29 years, that choice has held. The uncomfortable reality has remained hidden under layers of staging, legal maneuvering, public relations, and alternative narratives. But the medical records remain. The autopsy findings remain. And they tell a story that no amount of deflection can erase. In the next episode, we're going to walk through what we believe happened that night. Not with certainty we can't claim. Not with accusations we can't prove. But with the evidence as our map and logic as our guide. We're going to piece together a timeline that accounts for everything we've examined. The pineapple that places JonBenet awake and eating. The DNA that connects Burke to the scene. The chronic pattern that predated that night. The acute crisis that couldn't be hidden. The staging that followed. We're going to see how all these pieces, the ones that never quite fit the intruder story, come together when you allow yourself to consider what the evidence has been quietly suggesting all along. The truth wasn't waiting outside that house. It was already inside. It had been there for years, operating just beneath the surface of family life. And on December 25th, 1996, it finally emerged in a way that couldn't be ignored. What happened next? The staging, the lawyers. How do you face a truth that destroys everything you've built? Everything you believe about yourselves? You don't. You bury it deeper. You construct a story that allows you to live with what you can't bear to acknowledge. And you defend that story for the rest of your lives. No matter who asks, no matter what evidence surfaces, no matter how many people see through it. Because the alternative, the truth, is unbearable.